Our second contributor this afternoon will be Eric Hurst. Eric is the Duane Rath Professor of Economics and the Neubauer Family Faculty Fellow at Chicago Booth. He joined the faculty in 1999. His research includes work on macroeconomic policy, consumption, time use, entrepreneurship, household financial behavior, and real estate. His newest research includes Social Security and Unsecured Debt, which is forthcoming in the Journal of Public Economics. He's a past recipient of the TIAA-CREF Paul A. Samuelson Award for Outstanding Scholarship on Lifelong Financial Security. Please join me in welcoming Eric Hurst.
This is my first time doing the business forecast lunch, but I do about 6 of these a year. And my style is a little bit different than we're going to see from Mike and Marvin a little bit, because I'm a teacher at Trade. So I'm going to teach you guys a little bit something that I don't think you knew, but it's going to be related to the forecast that's going to come. And the first part of my talk, probably the bulk of my talk, and I think it's going to be the most interesting to you guys, is trying to understand what happens to housing markets over cycles and what's going to happen to housing prices going forward. Because when I get into the second part of my talk and trying to link that to the real economy, what's going to happen to the banking sector and consumption, it's going to be directly still linked to what's going on to the housing market. So I'm going to show you some data here. Okay, what you're seeing up here is real house price appreciation by country from the periods 1970 to 1999. When I say real, it just means after I adjust for the fact that inflation's going up. So net of changes of inflation. And what you could see across all countries over long periods of time, 1970 to 2000, again, the second period is the 2000-2006, the real rate of housing growth is about 1% real. Okay? The median and mean across countries is just a little bit over 1% real. Now, in the 1999 to 2006 period, prices grew at about 5% per year across all major countries. Okay? The U.S. being one of those, where the U.S., we tend to grow about 6% per year over this time period. Now, if I go to U.S. states, I could do the same type of thing. Because while the U.S., I'll show you some data on this in a second, while the U.S. prices accelerated sharply as a country as a whole, in recent periods, and people have called that as being unprecedented, what we're going to see is if we go to U.S. states, we might see patterns where we saw movements like we saw in the country as a whole over this time period. But the key point is, over long periods of time, again, a 1980 to 2000 average, this is the longest period my data allows me to go, the real return on housing is about 1% real, even though if we average across the states, it was about 4% real in the recent period. So the main thing is that the long-run return on housing over countries or states, if I did this for cities, you'd get a very similar thing, is relatively low, about 1% real. And if you go back to the historical data, I don't have this, but guys like Bob Schiller does, and guys like Chip Case do, and they have this data, and if you go back over long periods of time, like centuries, the return is about 0% real. Okay? Not return, when I say depreciation. And I'm going to explain why that has to be to you today. Okay? Despite the fact that 1% real is the average, most places cycle. Okay, what does that mean? It means big booms come and then big busts come. So what I'm plotting you here is country-level data. Each observation is a country-time pair, where the time interval is defined as the successive periods of positive price appreciations in a country. So some countries, like Japan in the 1980s, had an 80% return during the boom period. And when I say return, again, price appreciation in real terms. And if we do all the country's booms, that's on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis is the subsequent bust of these housing prices. How do I define a bust? The successive periods of negative price appreciation. And again, I sum up over all those periods. And what you see is a sharply downward relationship. Countries with big booms go to big busts. Countries with small booms have small busts. And if I take the same data and do this by U.S. metropolitan areas, you see the exact same pattern. And again, instead of defining cycles here, I'm just going to do 1980 to 1990 and 1990 to 2000. That's what my data allows me to do. But you're going to see some states, in this metropolitan area, some cities, like Boston, had a 60% price increase during the 80s. What happened during the 90s? Prices fell by about 40%. And if we plot this up, we get this sharp negative relationship. So we have these two facts going around in the back of our mind that we got to think about. The long-run price appreciation of residential properties is close to 0, or 1% real. And then you tend to have these cycles. Big booms are followed by big busts. So let me just tell you one more set of statistics, and I'll try to explain why that has to be. Okay, why that has to be. Now, when I tell you why it has to be, that's going to allow me to go to forecast what's going to happen to prices in the U.S. and the residential economy going forward. And once I do that, I can tell you what effect that's going to have on the real economy. Okay, but here's the fact. This is metropolitan level data, so these are cities. And I'm going to throw out any city prior to 2000. So this is data from 1980 to 2000 in city level data. 44 cities in the United States, okay, metropolitan areas, had what I would call substantial housing price booms during those 1980 to 2000 period. And I'm going to define a boom as having a 15% appreciation in real terms during any 3-year period. Okay, there's 44 of those. Of those cities that had a boom by that definition, the average size of the boom over the entire length of the boom was 55%. Okay, this is just like the U.S. boom that I'm going to show you in a little while. Average prices in the U.S. between 1997 and 2006 grew by 55%. Okay, every one of these cities, every single one, 100% of these cities had a housing price bust. Okay, and when I'm going to define a bust as a substantial decline in prices. The average size of the bust after these booms was 30%. Okay, every one of these cities. Okay, and the average length of the bust was 7 years. And most of the bust, about half of it, occurred in the first 2 to 3 years. Okay. Keep those in the back of your mind. And this is just what a cycle looks like. So if we take the data for the U.S., here's the recent U.S. data and housing prices by the OFEO price index. This is the price index put out by the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac organizations. I could show you Case-Shiller. It does a little bit steeper, but that's not important. You had this huge, huge price appreciation in real terms between 1997 and about 2006. Now, cycles in the U.S. aren't unprecedented. We had a boom in the 70s, followed by a bust in the early 80s. We had a boom in the mid-80s, followed by a sluggish period in the 1990s. So the cycles aren't unprecedented. For the U.S. as a whole, though, the magnitude was. Okay? And if we take a look at places like New York as a whole, this is New York State I have data for, you can see the boom was substantial in New York State during the 82 to 86 period, about 50% increase in housing prices, and then a decade, and this is the key part, a decade of housing price declines. Okay, this is one of those typical cycles that I'm showing you. In California, same thing. Okay. So why does this have to be? So why is it that housing price booms are followed by housing price busts, and why is it that the long-run return on housing is close to 0% real? And the reason for that is land is pretty elastic in the long run. So let's take a model. Again, go back to your just simple introductory economics course. Nothing fancy here. There's some demand and some supply. We have a demand for housing, me and you like to live in places, and supply of housing, at least in the short run, is relatively fixed. And suppose we have an interest rate shock where it gets cheaper to borrow, or we start allowing people who didn't have access to credit before to borrow, and all of a sudden you get an increase in demand for housing, all else equal. Okay? If supply is relatively inelastic in the short run, it pushes up prices. Now, where should supply be most inelastic? We could probably name the cities in our mind, New York City, San Francisco, pretty inelastic. So they have big price increases. And then there's places with less price increases. I don't want to offend anybody, but Duluth. Nobody's in Duluth, okay? So you got Duluth, and you got very little housing price cycles in Duluth, okay? Or Tulsa, or to some extent, Chicago, somewhere in between, okay? So you have these movements in housing price cycles that are dependent upon how constrained supply is. But what happens over time is supply eventually adjusts. So think about New York City in the mid-1980s. Most of the price appreciation, most of the housing was in Midtown Manhattan, okay, in Manhattan itself. What happened during the 1990s? People moved into Soho, and people moved into Greenwich Village, and people moved up the Upper West Side. And you think about Chicago just even 10 years ago. Most of the housing stock was in Lincoln Park, Lakeview, and Gold Coast. Now we have Wicker Park, and we have Andersonville, and we have a little bit in the South Loop or around Hyde Park, which has done very well. So supply eventually adjusts. And when supply adjusts, it starts putting downward pressure on prices. And the key component is, in the long run, everything's elastic. So even if you can't build any more houses in New York City, suppose you can't get any more housing in New York City, what do? You start Greenwich, Connecticut. Okay, and if you can't get any more houses into San Francisco, you have people moving up to Seattle and moving out to Idaho. New cities form. So in the long run, everything's elastic. So as long as there's some farmland out there, everything's going to be elastic in the long run, and that's how you get these housing price cycles. And there's data, and I could show you, I'm probably running low on time, but I got data that shows you that the supply movements in these this is metropolitan areas in the United States from 2000 to 2005. I kind of did some kind of regression stuff just to get a trend. But what we should look at is some places had big property price appreciations, like Rhode Island and California and New York and Florida. Those kind of same metropolitan areas, or those same states, had very little building relative to average states. So the reason that the prices went up was because supply was constrained. And on the downside, once they started falling between 2005 and 2007, the reason it was falling is because they had more building. Nevada and California and Florida had these big property price declines, but they had tremendous amount of buildings relative to everybody else. Supply adjusts, and that's the key thing. Supply adjusts in the long run. So if there's going to be one thing that you should think about, or let me just tell you one other thing before that, is that prices in the U.S. increased by, we'll call it 50% between 1997 and 2006 in real terms across the whole U.S. Some places, 110% in Las Vegas or Miami or Phoenix. Okay, so you had this variation, but as a U.S. as a whole, huge increases. And if we're going to take all this data that I showed you prior to 2000, country-level data, city-level data, state-level data, and do some statistical analysis, on the backside of these booms, okay, 60% of that is going to erode away. What does that mean? That house prices in the U.S. should fall by 25 to 30% on the backside of this boom. And currently, they've only fallen by about 10%. So what does this mean? It means housing prices are going to have much more decline coming forward in the U.S. economy on the whole. Okay? This is the level. My regression line predicts we got to fall back here. This is the level of prices. They go up a lot. They got to come down to this is the regression line kind of thing. We got a long way to go. So this is the take it to the bank prediction. Okay, the 100%. You know, when the other stuff I give you, I'm going to pick an unemployment rate and say, hey, 7.8%. That's kind of based on some guesses, but it's a guess. It could be 7.2, could be 7.9, 8.1. This is a take it to bank prediction. Okay? Take it has to happen. U.S. housing prices will fall substantially during the next few years. Okay? Basically, over the next 5 years, in real terms, adjusting for inflation, I'd expect them to fall by another 15% at a minimum, in real terms. Okay? How does this occur? A lot of that's going to occur in nominal falls over the next few years. What does that mean? House prices are going to keep falling. So when you open up the newspaper for the next probably a month, year and a half or so, you're going to keep seeing OFEO price indexes and Case-Shiller price indexes falling. And then what's going to happen is in nominal terms, they're going to stay fixed. And then what that means is as prices in the rest of the economy go up and houses stay fixed, the real return will kind of erode away the remaining part. But you should see this over the next few years. And this is 100%. I am 100% guaranteed on this, okay? I will wager lots of salaries or Ted's endowment or whatever you want to put up against it. And we can, I got it, Ted, I got it. Okay. So the next part of the question is, why do we care? Okay. What is the role of housing prices on the real economy? And this is the question we should be thinking about. Because part of the reason we might have gotten where we've gotten today is because housing prices have fallen. Now, how does that work? Well, Mike talked a little bit about there's some effect of the housing sector itself on the real economy. Just like we make pizzas and just like we build cars, sometimes we build houses. And when we had a buildup of assets in the housing building sectors, lots of ladders and lots of drywall, that kind of drove up GDP. And now as we stop building houses as much, we don't need as much drywall and we don't need as much ladders, and we're basically the construction sector is contracting. So that's part of it, but that's a second order thing, and Mike kind of said that, and that's a second order thing. There's some effect on consumers, which is basically when our houses are worth more, we basically have more wealth, and when you and I feel wealthier, we tend to spend more. If we look at the data, this is also a kind of a relatively small effect. It's not a zero effect, it's a smaller effect. But when you and I tend to get in trouble, our housing is one source of equity we could tap into when we lose our job, and when our housing equity goes away, we can't tap into our housing equity when we lose our job, and as a result, spending has to fall more than it would otherwise if there was value in the house. So if those housing declines were unplanned by the consumers, it might have some effect on consumer spending. I will argue that is still going to be second-order effects on the consumers. Okay? The real effect is what you've been hearing about in the news for the last year and a half, which is during this time period, banks made a whole bunch of loans based upon these assets, which were the houses. Okay? And we could talk about whether the banks had a wrong pricing mechanism or maybe they didn't have a right pricing mechanism, but the incentives were there, and they lent a lot to people despite the fact that housing prices, where they might have known housing prices are going to come down. And as housing prices come down, you and I are more likely to default. And when you and I are more likely to default, the payout to the banks are less. The bank balance sheets take a hit. When the bank balance sheets take a hit, they're less likely to lend to each other, and it also makes them less likely to lend to me and you, or to firms who hire me and you. Okay? So the real effect that I'm concerned with, and this is the kind of the shock that started it, was the effect of house price declines on the balance sheets. And what you don't see out there, and again, I think it's a real risk going forward is how is going to be sustained housing price declines. Again, there's nothing we could do about this. We might be able to slow down the decline, but this is just an equilibrium force that's going to make housing prices decline. Okay? How does sustained housing price declines going forward going to affect bank balance sheets? Okay? And the answer is, I'm not sure of that. But we know it's going to put at least at a minimum, some minimal amount of stress on their balance sheets. And what's going to happen is the bank balance sheets themselves are going to be more distressed going forward. It's not going to go away tomorrow. Okay, it's not going to go away 6 months from now. This might linger for a year and a half, at least till nominal prices stop falling. Okay. Now, I don't know how big it's going to be, but it's going to create some uncertainty. And when I talk to you in the second part of my talk about what I'm most concerned about going forward, this is uncertainty is the biggest of the things that I'm concerned with. Okay. So other thoughts on my mind. What am I most concerned? Oh, this is something that I wrote these slides on Friday, and then all of a sudden they declared a recession on Monday. But the answer is, does it matter if we're in a recession? And the answer is no. Okay, what happens when they actually declare a recession? It's some guy who's a little bit, older than me. Bob Hall's a lot older than me. He's the guy who chairs the recession dating committee. But he's a guy like me. He's an academic macroeconomist who cuts together with a couple other academic macroeconomists. They sit together and declare we're in a recession. Does it matter for anything we're in a recession? No, I could care less if we grow at epsilon above or epsilon below GDP. What I really care about, and this is what we should be focusing on, is the U.S. growing at its potential level. Okay? And even if we start growing at 1%, they might actually say we're out of a recession. What you guys should be realizing is we're still below our potential level. So what we should be focusing on is, are we producing at our potential level? Are we producing at our trend growth rate? In the words, the semantics about whether we're in a recession or not, it's kind of less resonant now when they actually called it on Monday. But again, is of less interest to me. Okay, I still don't understand why 5 old guys could drive down 8% in the stock market when they basically just wake up and say there's a recession. But that's for the investors to think about. The other part is, are we in a Great Depression? That's just plain silly talk. I don't know. Great Depression, the unemployment rate was 25, 26%. Right now, it's 6. It's going to move to 7, Mike says, or 7.5, somewhere in there, 8. That's why I got a number like that too. Nowhere near 25%. Okay. I'm running short of time. I want to tell you one other thing, though, and I have lots of other stuff on my mind, but this is the most important thing, which is one thing that's good about disruptions on occasion is it teaches us policymakers how to manage shocks. So you're seeing massive amounts of injections by policymakers, central bankers like Ben Bernanke, informed treasury agents, or people who are informing the treasury agents, presidents trying to inject a lot of resources to stabilize the economy. And the reason is, we have basically 50 years of science. Sometimes you guys could laugh, but we consider ourselves scientists as macroeconomists. We're trying to figure out how economies work. Okay, and this is game day for us. We've basically spent the last, 40 years of our life thinking about what goes on, and we're good at it. And this is why shocks that might be of the proportion of financial shocks that occurred in the Great Depression won't have Great Depression effects, because we got a lot better at managing policy. Doesn't mean we're never going to have recessions. It just means any shock that occurs, we are just better managing now than we were in the past. And this is kind of an aside, but I think, I have tremendous amount of faith in our knowledge that we've put forth over the last 40 years or so. Okay. So the one thing that I'm most concerned about, and I don't want to go into details because Mike touched on some of these, going forward, at least in the short run, is the level of uncertainty that exists in the economy. So there's fundamentals in the economy. Those are like the real things, like interest rates and productivity. And then there's other, what I call, softer things in the economy. The Dr. Phil-ish part of the economy, if you so will, which is how people are feeling, the amount of risk that they perceive, and how they're going to respond to that risk. And this tremendous amount of uncertainty, we're seeing it through the banking sector, and this is part of the reason why I think the banking sector is not going to respond as quick as other people do. Why? Because that uncertainty of the house price declines is going to stay with them for a long period of time. Okay? So even though we're going to be good at managing shocks, the uncertainty might linger a longer period of time than it would have in past recessions. And the second thing is, consumers, you and I, take cues from the real economy, or from the policymakers and the stock market and the employers in the economy. When you and I see our firms laying it off, even if you and I don't get laid off, you think we might be able to be laid off. And as a result, we curtail our spending. And when you and I see banks not lending to each other and banks failing, you're like, oh my God, things are really bad. And when you hear Treasury secretaries come on the news and say, blah, 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 Great Depression, blah, 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 like my mom did, she says, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. What should I do? Just put all my money under my mattress? I'm like, Mom, relax. It's okay. Okay? But you hear this tremendous amount of uncertainty out there, and that's going to be with us for a while. And even though this recession, I do not predict is going to be as deep as past recessions, given the size of the shock. Why? Because we're good at managing policy. I think it's going to linger long, and we're going to be below trend longer than it would be otherwise, because I don't see this uncertainty being resolved anytime in the short run, especially since housing prices are going to keep declining, and that's going to continue to put stress on bank balance sheets. Despite whether we inject money today, they're going to need a little bit more money tomorrow because defaults are still going to continue. Okay? So, yeah, am I done? Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you. It's good. I could go all night. There we go. Oh, sorry. Okay. So this is, I think I said, I had some other stuff, but we could talk about that after, which are basically residential construction is going to fall by 15 to 20%. I think unemployment, things are going to get worse, and it might go up 7.5%, 8% before things even get better. Okay? But the sluggishness, it's never going to get the depths of some of the 1982 recession, but it's nowhere near going to be as short as the 1990 or the 2000 recession, because this uncertainty is going to remain throughout the economy. And then the last thing I was going to talk about, whether it has this gross effects over the things we're doing now affects growth over long periods of time, but we could talk about that after. Email me or something. Okay, I'm done.